Welcome, everyone. I'm Kate Livingston, Assistant Director for Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion at Center for Research on Learning and Teaching. I'm a white woman with long brown hair, and I'm wearing a black and white striped sweater, and I'm sitting in a home office. I'm so pleased that you've chosen to join us for this year's conference, Toward an Anti-Ableist Academy, Advancing Inclusion, Diversity, Equity, and Accessibility at University of Michigan. Throughout the month of October, this conference includes 11 online sessions, each between 90 and 60 minutes as a part of UM's Disability Community Month activities. These 11 sessions focus on the progress made and the work still to be done on the recommendations to close accessibility gaps across campus for disabled students, faculty, staff at University of Michigan. So I join you today as a member of the Student Idea Board Pedagogy Implementation Committee, which focused on advancing the Idea Board report recommendations that related to students' experiences in the classroom, which is why I'm really excited to be here to introduce today's session titled Seeing Invisible Disabilities in the Classroom, Visions from 3 Perspectives. We have 3 amazing speakers for you today. Natalie Wojcik is an undergraduate senior in LS&A, triple majoring in psychology, Spanish, and linguistics. Julia Wiener joins us as an alum of LS&A from the class of 2021. And Elise Portnoy is an associate professor in English language and literature and a faculty associate in American culture and has been teaching at Michigan for more than 20 years. So Elise, if you're ready, I'm happy to turn things over to you to get us started.
Thank you, Kate. It is so wonderful to be here. And I'm going to get started with some logistics. Let me share my screen here. Okay, so we are going to, I'm going to go through the agenda. And I do want to mention, even right from the start, that this slide deck is available online and all of the links are available there if that would be helpful to you. So as Kate said, my name is Elise Portnoy and I am a woman in my 50s. My skin tone reflects my 3/4 European and 1/4 Middle Eastern heritage. I use she, her pronouns. I'm wearing blue glasses and I have brown curly hair that is pulled back in a single braid. I'm also in my home office with a blue sheet behind me. Our plan for today is listed on the first slide. We have the welcome, and then we're gonna go through some of the processes and logistics for today's session. I'll do a land acknowledgement and a brief overview. We'll do some gratitude giving and then talk about get into the main content of our session. Also on this slide deck, which will be periodically put into the chat, are mine, Julia's, and Natalie's contact information, and we invite you to contact us at any point if that would be useful to you. So as I mentioned, the slide deck is available online, and our fabulous tech people will be putting that into the chat pretty regularly. The links there are live, and also links we put into the chat. The Zoom Spotlight feature will be used for the speaker or speakers who will be talking today, and also the ASL interpreter throughout the session. The transcript for the session is by CART Transcription, and you can click on the Zoom transcript feature to access that transcript. The chat feature is active and we are going to try to monitor it, and we just found out that there are some people behind the scenes who will help us with that. But we are going to try to monitor the Q&A feature and also take some questions at the end of our session. Learning Anishinaabe for me, which is the language of the Anishinaabe people, the Anishinaabe Nation, comprised of the Ojibwe, Ottawa, and Potawatomi bands of people. Learning Anishinaabe Bowen, among many other things, means for me looking from different perspectives. So, for example, Jesus, what in English is called the sun, Anishinaabe Moen is something that gives off warmth and therefore is animate. The word for what English speakers call ant, Ngun, literally means goes into the ground. There's no specifically gendered pronoun, no she or he, in Anishinaabe. How much our world shifts as we consider our speaking of it and are speaking about it. As when, for example, we speak about accommodating disabilities or making accessible our courses. Miigwech, thank you to Anishinaabe peoples and tribes who granted the land which birthed the University of Michigan in exchange for the promise that their children and children's children get an education here. I acknowledge that tremendous gift and also acknowledge that the University of Michigan has in many ways failed to enact that promise. Today, let's bring a promise of integrity to our access. With that, I am going to do a quick overview of our session. So we are going to focus on access in the classroom. So specifically inside the confines both of the classroom space and also campus spaces, not so much about deadlines and test accommodations, and also not so much about presentations, although we do have a slide in the slide deck, if that's useful for you, about ways to make presentations in class more accessible. So we're thinking through more about the classroom space, and we'll start by talking about our experiences with one particular invisible disability and then branch out from there. And so with that, Juliet, can I turn it over to you to get us started?
So I'm Julia. I'm a University of Michigan alumni from the class of 2021. I have pale white skin. I'm a female in my early 20s. I'm wearing a cream cardigan with my University of Michigan lanyard at work, and I have straight light brown hair with green eyes. So we just wanted to give a thanks to everyone who was here, everyone who responded to our Google form, the conference organizers, Pam McGuinity, Crystal Flynn, Dilip Daz, and Ronnie Rios. Also the conference planners, which is the idea board, and all of the conference supporters listed below. So now we are going to discuss an invisible disability in the classroom, which happens to be my disability from 3 different perspectives. So the beginning of class for me has always entailed explaining my disability to a professor. When I was 14, I was diagnosed with a form of inflammatory arthritis, making it difficult for me to sit for extended periods of time without experiencing pain. If I was having a bad flare and needed to go on a short loop in the hallway, this usually was in exchange for missing course material. As a kid, I often felt self-conscious about my arthritis and also having to get up and leave class. I was nervous that classmates would notice me leaving and ask why I had to leave class periodically, which would result in me having to explain that I had some illness that most kids weren't familiar with. As I grew older, I became significantly less self-conscious and was more preoccupied about the time I would sometimes have to miss from class. Every professor who I have disclosed this to made sure that I felt accommodated in their classroom by allowing me to take the breaks I needed, but no professor had ever made their class more accommodating to my needs until I met Elise. On the first day of my course with Elise, I spoke to her at the end of class, giving her my short description of my condition that I was accustomed to telling instructors. I was expecting the usual response. However, Elise had a different idea. We spoke about that idea of shifting the norm of sitting in the classroom to having some students stand up and occasionally stretch throughout class time while others sat. At the beginning of our class, after that conversation, Elise made an announcement explaining that there was a student in class who had a certain condition that prevented them from sitting down for the duration of our 1 hour and 20-minute course. Further, Elise explained that it would be great if some students could alternate standing throughout class so that that student didn't have to feel singled out by standing up, and that otherwise that student would have to leave occasionally and miss class time. I was hesitant that my peers would not stand, but this was not the case. Many of my classmates alternated sitting and standing throughout class, including Natalie, who is here with us today. I was never standing alone. I didn't realize the extent to which making a class more accessible would not only help my joints, but would help me in other ways I hadn't imagined. I felt so supported by Elise and the rest of my classmates and was able to not have to ask for the information covered when I stepped out. After learning about the disability model and the 4 levels of oppression from Elise's course, I realized that I had internalized the norm of sitting in a classroom. I thought of excuses for asking about how to be better accommodated, that it wasn't the professor's job. After hearing myself say that aloud, it sounds so silly. Of course, professors do want to make their students in their course feel more accommodated. However, my class with Elise made me realize the true difference between accommodation and accessibility, and that while all classes were required to accommodate students in some way, they were not required to increase access in the way that Elise's course had done for me. Throughout my experience as a student at Michigan, before taking a course with Elise, I was always looking to make myself adapt to the norms of being in a classroom, but had never thought about how a classroom could be made more accessible to me. This change of being in a classroom, from sitting to some sitting and some standing, which became our class's new norm, could be implemented in other classroom spaces. Although I knew this, I was still hesitant to ask professors if we could adapt this model in my other classes. It seems like such a big change, despite the fact that I had seen it work successfully with my own eyes. For these changes to be made, whose job is it really? Is it an individual with a disability's job to stand up for themselves? Or is it a professor's job to restructure their classroom to make it more accessible? Is it a designated person associated with the course, like a GSI or department head? Or does it need to be implemented institutionally by the University of Michigan for changes like this to take place on our campus? And even if changes are made to increase access, will these more accessible models of being in a classroom ever replace an old norm? These are also questions we have yet to answer. Looking back on my experience as an undergraduate at Michigan, I realized how much simpler it could have been for me if classroom structures were made with flexibility in mind. Instead of making students have to ask for the accommodations they needed to make a course more accessible to them, the opposite can be done. Instructors can ask students how they can make their class more accessible, decreasing the burden of individuals with disabilities from having to adapt to spaces that were constructed with able-bodied peoples in mind. Okay, now we will hear from Natalie's perspective.
Hi, everyone. I am Natalie Wojcik. I am a woman in my early 20s. I use she, her pronouns. I have fair skin and long light brown hair and hazel eyes. I'm wearing a black shirt today, and I'm using a virtual background on Zoom, and it is kind of a bluish green teal color. So now for my perspective, as Julia mentioned, Elise informed us pretty early on in our course that we would be shifting norms in the classroom to make learning more accessible to a student who is having to leave class to move around, and asked that several students take turns standing so that the student who initially made the request could remain anonymous. Standing in the classroom was something I never even considered doing, and initially I felt very surprised. I remember being so surprised, in fact, that I told basically everyone I know that I was taking an English class where we had the option to stand up when we wanted to, and also the option to sit down when we wanted to. Sitting down in class had become so ingrained into my daily routine that I would just walk in, throw my backpack on the floor, sit down, listen to the instructor for the duration of the class, and not get up until it was time to leave for my next class or to go home. Standing up in the middle of class did not fit into this routine, and while I was excited to switch up this routine and this norm, I wondered if this would work and if other students would buy into it. Disrupting the classroom norm of sitting down was obviously something really new to me, so I knew it would take an open perspective to begin understanding the situation before taking action. I knew that each student's success in the course really mattered to Elise because her syllabus explicitly said this under a section titled Accessibility. Knowing this, I wanted to contribute to our classroom culture of respect and inclusion, so I began my process of understanding, breaking down our classroom standing norms by doing my best to empathize with the student who made the request to stand. Obviously, it's impossible for me to know all of their lived experiences, but I tried to put myself in the student's shoes as well as I could. As a student athlete, I know how hard it can be to miss class when I have to travel, even with excused absences and plans in place to make up the work. So I had a basic understanding of how much having the ability to stand and not miss out on class could potentially benefit this student. What I didn't know was how this person was feeling as we shifted the way we exist in the classroom space. And I guess that they were probably feeling a sense of relief, but also nervous as to whether or not people would actually stand alongside them. I realized that my concerns about shifting the norms successfully were most likely pretty similar to theirs, and that the best way to make sure this worked was to assume a level of personal responsibility myself. I couldn't just sit back and wait for somebody else to stand because everyone else just might sit back and do the same. So on the first day we were offered the option to stand, I did, and pretty quickly several other students did too. And this continued throughout the semester so that there was never a point where there was only one person standing. A few of my takeaways from this entire experience in Elise's class were that there were some classes where I stood for 2 minutes and some where I stood for close to the entire 80 minutes. And when I wanted to sit down, another student quickly stood up to take my place. There was a genuine willingness of every student in our class, as well as Elise, to make the space more accessible, and I truly believe that this was inspired by the language on our syllabus. For students who were able to, they moved between standing around the perimeter of the room and sitting when they wanted to without blocking the view of other students. Finally, it was never obvious which student it was that initially requested the ability to stand in the classroom, and I worked really closely with Julia throughout the course of the semester, but never knew it was her until she shared it with me pretty recently. The option to stand in class is something that is scalable to other class sizes as well. For example, in a larger lecture hall, there could be a designated aisle or side of the room for standing so that the view of other students isn't blocked. When transferring the ideas of breaking ableist norms from my class with Elise and Julia to other classes, I believe it would be helpful for all instructors to include a section about accessibility on the course syllabus. This ensures that each student is aware that their needs and success matters in the course, and also begins to set up the expectation for students in the course to assume a level of personal responsibility in pushing against ableist norms, even if those norms don't affect them personally. Creating an accessible classroom environment is fundamental to the success of each and every student. Next, I'm going to turn it over to Elise for her perspective.
Thanks, Natalie, and thanks, Julia. I appreciate all the work that you both have done, and I'm looking forward to the rest of the session where we'll talk about some really specific ways to break some of the ableist norms that we found in the classroom. And I realized, and thank you for somebody who pointed this out, that in the survey that we wrote, we used the word undergraduate classrooms, and I apologize for that. I think that Natalie, Julia, and I were thinking about our perspective and our lived experiences, and we do hope that the rest of the presentation, as well as what has already come before, is applicable to undergraduate as well as graduate spaces. And also we do mention other campus spaces, including in meetings. And so we hope that that will work in those ways as well. I apologize for leaving that out. One of the things that I do want to talk about in terms of my perspective before we shift to the next section is what I'm realizing is in that moment, in that class, breaking that norm of sitting and standing. I love the way Natalie talks about kind of coming to a class and putting the backpack down and sitting down was great. And part of why I think it worked was because I was able to tie it into some of the course material. And I continue to look for ways to encourage students to take it out to other classes. And that's my next opportunity for kind of growth in this, is talking with students about moving this forward. So as Julia said, that it's not just a person who needs a particular kind of accommodation is doing the asking, but how are we all pushing on these norms and pushing for access? And so hopefully the things that we're going to present in the next two sections of the session will do some work in that way. How do we carry this idea of disrupting these ableist norms in the classroom and into other spaces as we go? And I'm going to share my screen again. And I think Natalie, you are going to start us off once I get my screen shared.
So some examples, well, here are some examples that we have for breaking ableist norms in the classroom and just some practical ways that you can do that. So many students may benefit from having the option to use fidgets in the classroom as a way of improving focus. In our classroom, a box of fidgets was placed near the door so that students could grab one on the way into class and then return it on the way out. This was pre-COVID though, so for a more COVID or germ-friendly version, Elise had the idea of using rubber bands. So a student could then take a rubber band, fidget with it during class if they chose to, and then just take that with them following the conclusion of the class. Next, we have slides that don't rely on color. So another way to increase accessibility in the classroom is for instructors to create slides that do not rely on color. For example, if contrast between two ideas is shown using two colors that a colorblind student doesn't have the ability to distinguish between, then they would not have the same access to learning the contrast between those ideas that students who are not colorblind would have. Next, we have beach balls and other props. So some instructors have introduced props such as tennis balls to increase active participation in class, which basically involves tossing the tennis ball around the classroom to each student when it is their turn to speak. However, for students who may be visually impaired, such a small object can be extremely difficult to catch. So a larger, slower object such as a beach ball might work a little bit better, although this could obviously still present challenges for students who are blind or physically not able to catch a ball. So that might not be the best prop to use in the classroom, but we are open to ideas if you guys happen to have any. And then finally on this slide, we have roles on the teaching team. So Michigan offers many large lecture-based courses, as I'm sure many of you know, and there can be hundreds of students in these courses. So in these types of large classes, the professor usually indicates early on who to go to for exam questions, which is often a graduate student instructor or a GSI. And students are typically told to submit accommodation requests within the first couple weeks of the course. However, as we shift towards increasing accessibility, in addition to existing accommodations, students in larger courses that have several members of the teaching team may find it useful to have a designated point person of contact to turn to for questions and recommendations for increasing access during lecture time, or just overall accessibility in the course, like I mentioned before, maybe standing up in the aisles. And I believe Julia is going to take the next slide.
Okay, so these are some other practical examples of breaking ableist norms in our classroom. So for physical ways of occupying this space, as we spoke about, while it's a norm to sit while learning classroom material, students can effectively learn while standing or also sitting if standing is accessible to them. For opting out for verbal participation, there are alternative forms of participating in classroom discussions, especially if verbal participation is difficult for some students. For example, instead of being called on, students can demonstrate their understanding of the material by writing down the answer or by sending their instructor a quick email. Students can also create a nameplate for themselves with a pass slide, making it clear to others if they want to pass on a particular question. For the bullet about specifics about bathroom breaks and other forms of self-care, Some students have disabilities that require them to use the restroom more often, and it may make it easier for them if instead of having to raise your hand and ask to go to the bathroom, if they were just able to leave the room discreetly. And we also thought about having a tab on Wolverine Access or Canvas for suggestions or some sort of form of campus resource. When I say Canvas, we thought about something similar to the Pinwheel Wellbeing tab that was added to Canvas, I think, last year. And now I will pass it on to Elise.
Thank you, Julia. And so as you can tell, we've been listing some ideas, some ways to break some able storms in the classroom. Some of you already are doing this and you're already doing them in wonderfully well ways. And some of these might be newer for some of you. Some of them carry on from pre-pandemic, some post-pandemic. Another thing that we've been talking about is volume, especially with masks. And now I bring volume signs into class and I pass them around so students can hold them up to alert other students visually about whether things are loud enough. People are being loud enough in their expressions, so we're not interrupting people, but people can see, as well as having some auditory cues. Also, we've talked about slides and we'll continue to talk about slides and making slides available beforehand, even in the humanities. I would love to hear if people have experiences with this in the chat. I'm just now learning that PowerPoint has a function where it can subtitle what's being heard in the room. And we just tried this out in class today, and I'm hoping it's going to work. So even if you don't use PowerPoint, but if you have a blank slide up in the classrooms on campus, you can connect the audio that people were using for hybrid classes with the pandemic, and subtitles will go onto the screen in a classroom, which I'm sure has all kinds of pluses and minuses, right? Like I would hope that that would not get used instead of CART or ASL transcription if necessary. And also I could see a lot of advantages to that. So if anybody has done that in class and wants to drop that in the chat, I'd love to hear more about that too. And then really rethinking the structures of our courses, right? With, like, for example, gameful models in a class, having lots of different kinds of assignments and flexible due dates, and having due dates where some students can do like kind of even split deadlines throughout the semester, and other students can pick up more points by doing activities throughout the semester, right? So rethinking even things down to the structures of the assignments, and we can talk more if people want to about any of these during the Q&A as we go. So these are a dozen or so of the things that we were thinking about that would be portable and scalable. As I said, I know that we're talking to some people who are doing this for the first time and some people who are really expert at this, and we would love to use some of the experience and the expertise in the virtual room. Julia, do you want to talk about that too, and also lead us into the break?
Yes, so now we'll take a quick break, and if anyone has any questions or just wants to share an idea, they can send it in the chat.
And so a 2-minute break, feel free to get up, walk around and things like that, and we'll call you back in about 2 minutes. Hello, welcome back. I'm going to share my screen again. And we're going to go through and take a look at some of the suggestions. Oh, I have to press the share button. As we keep going, one of the things that came up as Natalie and I were, as Natalie and Julia and I were talking, were ways to have this happen, like make it easier, including for students, graduate and undergraduate students, to walk into a classroom or a space on campus and see about disrupting these norms. And so one of the places we wanted to look was syllabus and kind of opening statements and things like that. Julia, do you want to get us started with your example?
Yes. So this is an example from one of my classes that I took at my time at Michigan. This section of the syllabus reads, students with special needs, we want everyone to be successful in this course. If you have a documented learning disability or other special need that requires accommodation, we are glad to help. Please notify the department, whatever department it was, which is remaining anonymous, and student service office as early in the term as possible so that we can make suitable arrangements. So what I found problematic with this syllabus statement was the special needs title, because it shows how a classroom is inaccessible and needs to be made to accommodate those with disabilities. Also, other language was problematic to me. I thought that access in a classroom should be expanded to all students, and you don't necessarily need to have a documented disability to increase access in a classroom. The use of the term special is also used again. There's also a clear push towards students utilizing SSD, delegating the responsibility to them, whereas the statement should be about increasing the accessibility in the classroom and also utilizing SSD in partnership to help facilitate this. So now Elise, I think, is going to talk a little bit about CRLT.
Thanks, Julia. So we wanted to just pull a couple of examples of some syllabi statements. The one that I have put on here that you see now is from CRLT. I'm a huge fan of CRLT. And in fact, Matt Kaplan, who was one of the people who wrote this, is dynamite. And a lot of my teaching has just expanded in wonderful ways because of the terrific people at CRLT. And I sent them an email and told them I was going to problematize this statement, which, by the way, I should note, they have since pulled, and CRLT, it sounds like, is committed to rethinking this. I think just it had gotten dated, but the syllabus statement has gotten picked up on lots of people's syllabi, right? And so accommodations, this is CRLT's advice, and this was available a couple of weeks ago when we were playing around with this presentation. Accommodations, you should also include, and now I'm reading from the slide, a section or a statement on accommodations for students. It can address multiple learning needs or individual needs. An example would be, please see me or email me if you require special accommodations due to learning disabilities, religious practices, physical requirements, medical needs, or any other reason, right? So the due to, right, that the problem here is people's disabilities or religious practices rather than access into our courses. And so what would it look like if we made that shift in our syllabi, in our agendas for our meetings, in the ways that we ask people for how our meetings, for example, could be more accessible? And this is an example again from CRLT, and we see this on lots of syllabi. So I did a screenshot of a sample syllabus, and then I typed up what it says. So if you feel you need an accommodation for any sort of disability, please make an appointment to see me during office hours. And so again, we see that model getting picked up in lots of different places. If you need accommodation, come see me. And so many people who are at this meeting will, of course, recognize the idea that it really locates the problem with the student or what a student brings rather than in making the class more accessible. And I wanted to also note on LS&A's, this is again a couple weeks ago, but they're syllabus statements. So this is LS&A's advice, in part because we're just sort of tracing, right? Like, how does this cultural knowledge, how do these norms just get built and stay in place for such a long time? So LS&A's advice and other places on this page have been updated. The University of Michigan is committed to providing equal opportunity for participation in all classes, programs, services, and activities. Requests for accommodations by persons with disabilities may be made by contacting the Services for Students with Disabilities office located in Haven Hall with a phone number. Once your eligibility for an accommodation has been determined, you will be issued a verified individual service accommodation visa form. Now, of course, this has been updated with the Accommodate system, and LS&A, I'm sure, will shift this soon. please present this form to me at the beginning of the term or at least 2 weeks prior to the need for the accommodation, right? So again, it locates the problem with the student who needs the accommodation. And there's this idea that you go someplace to become eligible. And even as that is often the case because of the resources that are available at SSD and the law, there's nothing here about educating people who are running meetings and people who are teaching classes about making our classes more accessible. Right, so shifting these cultural norms and pushing against some of the ableist practices in the classroom is going to require playing around with some of this language and where we're getting from and where we're pulling it from. And so I am a little bit wary of, again, because we've been talking about my class a bit, but I did want to suggest an alternative, which may not work. Oh, sorry, before I do that, this is the SSD statement. In the SSD statement, you also see some interest in inclusion and equity, and then the making contact is updated. It's got the accommodate piece mentioned here. Concerns, please contact your SSD coordinator or visit SSD's current student webpage. SSD considers aspects of the course design, course learning objectives, and the individual academic and course barriers experienced by the student. So we see some access issues coming in here and accommodate, but what would it look like to push even harder and maybe start naming some ways to provide access? That said, I'm thinking more about how we take ownership, right? So how, when we're running our meetings or when we're going to meetings, like if we're going to the PTO meeting, are we hitting that request live transcript button? Are we pushing on breaking those norms? Are we owning it? What are we doing in our meetings and in our classrooms so that it's not just about SSD having to accommodate, but also how are we taking ownership for increasing access? Right? Whether it's that we're walking into a space and we're asking for it because we want to be disrupting those norms, or whether it's practices that we are bringing into our classrooms. And so a possible model that may not work for anybody, but I wanted to toss it out here. This is from my syllabi from the current semester, accessibility. Your success in this class matters to me. Many of us will need some accommodations in this class. Do you know now that there are circumstances that may affect your performance in this class? Are there ways we can work together to increase the accessibility of our course to your needs and to support your success in our course? If so, please let me know within the first 2 weeks of the semester. If things come up later, please let me know as soon as you are able. And let's stay in touch throughout the semester to see whether your needs have changed and whether our accommodations can be improved as we go. Accessibility in this course is not a one-time meeting, but rather a process to which I am committed. Standard procedures at the University of Michigan include that students who may need an accommodation for any sort of a disability contact Services for Students with Disabilities. And I encourage you to do that too, if it would be useful. Right? So how are we thinking about, from the start, reframing this question about ableist norms in the classroom and taking ownership, and also thinking about ways to encourage our students and colleagues to take ownership in other places and spaces. And I think now Natalie and Julia and I together will go over a couple of summaries about this culture. And so I don't know, I think we're all spotlight, or Julia, we need to add your spot. There we go. Natalie, you want to start?
Yes, thank you, Elise. So our first point on creating this culture in our classrooms of accessibility has to do with defining ableism on course syllabi, perhaps with a list of some common ableist norms. So students learn about many forms of discrimination and prejudice throughout school. But if I'm being honest, I had never even heard the term ableism until I came to college. Of course, I knew that discrimination based on ability existed, but I was unaware that there was a word to define it or the many ways that ableism manifests itself in the norms of my day-to-day life. We believe it would be helpful to include a definition of ableism on all course syllabi and maybe include a list of some common ableist norms as well, especially norms that affect invisible disabilities, since these may be less obvious. Naming and defining ableism is a great first step to creating more inclusive and accessible spaces, especially in the classroom and on campus. Speaking of the classroom and campus, ableist norms extend beyond just the classroom. They go into study spaces, meeting rooms, and more. And similarly, creating access goes beyond testing accommodations. So we must be aware that students' needs may change from a day-to-day basis throughout the semester, and that accommodating a student's individual needs is a process, not just a deadline. And like Julia mentioned in her perspective, does it always have to be the student with the disability that needs an accommodation that should be pushing for access? Or can it be the lead instructor or GSIs or other students or someone appointed from the department that's really pushing for access and being that point person who is creating a more accessible space? And I think Julia is going to continue with the rest of the points on this slide.
So as Elise described in her syllabus statement, it's not always a deadline that needs to be in a syllabus. It should be a process. Many syllabus statements require 2 weeks notice, or that classes that I've taken have required that before an exam. And professors state that they prefer to know about accommodations in the beginning of the semester when that could be an ongoing conversation. Another point was the proof, what sort of proof is required, and we can just make the typical norms of being in a classroom more accessible and not have to have this sort of proof. Additionally, it also raises the question if there needs to be documentation required to make something more accessible to someone, and if that is necessary in all cases. For example, if a student thinks text is too small in a PowerPoint, it would probably be beneficial for all students if the text could be made larger. And then I think Elise is going to talk about the last point.
Yeah, thanks, Julia. So, and we get back to this naming the issue, right? Like, what is the issue? Is it access to like my course or our course or my meeting? Like, where are we taking ownership? Not only accommodation of a person or a disability. I had a terrific conversation yesterday with Dr. Okunlami. Thank you again, Dr. O, for that conversation. Hearing all kinds of things like more people are being hired and temps have just been hired and people are now answering the phone at SSD, which is terrific. And also, like, the bottom line is the more ownership we take of making our courses more accessible, the more pressure that takes off of SSD for these little things, right? And how can we communicate? How can we work with? How can we make sure that we are, as I said earlier, like kind of how am I having my students go out into the world and with the tools that they need to disrupt these ableist norms, so that it's about me taking ownership and me making my class more accessible, which is not to say that SSD doesn't play a huge role, because there are all kinds of accommodations that I simply can't provide on my own. I need those resources, but that collaboration, like that we take some ownership and we do that work, I think is so important and so doable, like really so doable. And so we're going to turn to Q&A in a second, but we just had a couple of quick things that we want to leave you with this last slide. And so, like, expanding the expectations on our campus. So generate ways in addition to SSD for students to get access to our courses and to our meetings and to other places. Like, how can we get creative? How can we get generative? How can we do that work to increase and push against these ableist norms to increase access? Julia?
We can also normalize different ways of being in our classrooms, whether that means standing for some people, sitting for others, and using fidget toys, in any way that would help a student learn more effectively. I think Natalie is going to talk about the next point.
We must continue to ask for disruptions to ableist norms in our classrooms and campus spaces. We hope that a few of the examples we mentioned here, such as offering the option to stand, having the option to opt out of verbal participation, and requesting captions in all meetings, will give you all some inspiration with a place to start if you haven't already. You do not need to be someone who identifies as a person with a disability to advocate for access.
Thank you. And now we can turn a little bit to some of the questions in the chat and kind of where they are. And I have to say, in a webinar, I'm not as good. Dilip, can you jump in and help? I was looking for some questions that we might want to prioritize. Can I?
Sure. Just look in your chat. There are some messages directly to the panelists that I sent.
Thank you. Okay. So let's see. Okay, so I'm seeing some to everyone. So okay. The slides. Okay, so there's I'm sorry.
Elise, if you stop sharing the slide, you can also see the Q&A box at the bottom of your screen.
Okay. All right, I'm going to go up. So, so the first one that I see here from some people believe so that UM students should certainly be empowered and accommodated, but not enabled or infantilized. Where do we draw the line? Natalie or Julie, I don't know if you want to start. And I guess one of the questions that I have, and part of this is I teach some of this in the class. And so sometimes what I ask my students is how much justice is enough justice, right? Like, so if we're talking about access, and if we're talking about equity, and if we're talking about having integrity around different body minds that are in our classes, how much justice is enough justice? And at what point do we kind of think about giving people access, equal access to our classes? And so, so somebody's asking, this is coming from the med school. We are also trying to increase accessibility and eliminate barriers to all of our educational sessions. I'd be curious to hear if anyone has any ideas for clinical teaching or any awareness of similar efforts. This is certainly out of my scope of experiences.
That's also particularly interesting to me because I was pre-med in college. So I would also be curious in that, but I'm not sure.
Okay. And Dr. O just said he'd be happy to connect with whoever is asking that question. I'm sure, Dr. O, you have all kinds of good experiences with that. I do see some things on here that's coming to the hosts and panelists about SSD. And I did talk to Dr. O about that. And it sounds like lots of people are being hired. Like, it sounds like the people who run SSD, as we know, are doing really, really good work and understand. I don't know if Dr. O wants to pop anything in there, that more people are being hired. And that's happening. And just my experience, I sent Dr. O an email asking some questions and he's like, let's meet. And we did. And so I encourage people to do that. Dilip, are there other questions that I should be looking for?
Sure. There's one question that just came up that said, I'd be very curious to hear about activating a syllabus statement other than reading it in the first class, or ways to make access an ongoing invitation, not just at the very beginning of the class.
I can answer, or I can talk about that a little bit. I've had some classes that have had the syllabus just on the front page of their Canvas, which really reminded everyone of the main goals and also about how they can further increase access in their own classroom space in that course.
Yeah, I just keep putting it in front of people, right? Like every class, I'm like, okay, I pass out I have my somewhere, I pass out my rubber bands. And part of the reason I pass out my rubber bands is to just get people thinking about those norms, right? Every time. And in the announcements that I send out each week, every few weeks, I put in my announcements, just checking in, anybody need anything around access and accommodation, right? It's just that presence. And I'm hoping that not only will that make a difference in my class, I'm also hoping that students will get used to it in my class and then will ask for it in other classes, right? Like, so how do I set that norm that this is just the way it should be? and then people will ask for it in other places and other ways. I'm seeing something about like standards and rigor and things like that, and a question about the flexibility with grading. And I'd be happy if somebody wants to kind of give me an email or get in touch with me about that. For me, gameful pedagogy helped a lot, including I started it pre-pandemic, but it was great during the pandemic because it gave all kinds of flexibility around different kinds of assignments and also different deadlines in a way that was manageable, because the university has software, Gradecraft, that makes the multiple deadlines and the multiple activities possible and doable from an instructor perspective. I had to become a much better teacher because I had to make really concrete my learning goals and what I was asking students to do. So there was a learning curve there for sure. But part of my commitment was making sure that I could maintain the rigor of my classes. And I think that that's, I think that it's deeply problematic that people see it as an either or, right? Either we're flexible and we're accessible, or we're rigorous. It just doesn't make sense, right? That I think that there's a way to be creative, that there's a way to push ourselves in terms of our own professional development, such that we can create classes that are really, really rigorous and also that are really, really accessible. Julia, Natalie, I think we're getting close. Do you want to end? Is there something that you want to say at the end?
Well, I think if that's everything, we just want to thank you all for attending. We really appreciate you all being here today. And I believe we are going to pass it back over to Kate now.
I don't know if Kate's still around and what our timing is. I think Kate was going to make a plug. Kate, if you're around, feel free to interrupt me. But Kate was going to make a plug because the upcoming workshops, the ones that have already happened, are available online. And there are another at least 7 or 8 really great workshops that are available. Addie, I don't know if you can put the prompt into the chat. But I think that was probably what Kate was going to do, was close us out. Thanks again to the idea board and to all the support that we had. Thank you, Natalie and Julia, for working with us, and go to more sessions because there are at least another 7 or so that are happening in the future. Thank you, everybody.